Hello everyone and welcome back to Lost Planeswalker. You're here with me, Jesse, the Lost Planeswalker, and today we're talking about Trample in this Back to the Basics video. Trample is a very strong keyword. If you've ever played with it, which I'm sure many of you have, if not all of you, you will know this. Now, this video will cover how Trample works, some cards that are known for Trample, and finally, I'll be suggesting some commanders who revolve around Trample or Trample becomes an important part of their play style. But let's start by talking about Trample and see how it works. Something I want to say right off the bat here before I get into this is that this is a very long explanation section, so if you're just interested in checking out some of those Trample cards, maybe skip ahead to where I start talking about those commanders and whatnot. But let's start by looking at Trample. 702.19 Trample. 702.19a, Trample is a static ability that modifies the rules for assigning an attacking creature's combat damage. The ability has no effect when a creature with Trample is blocking or is dealing non-combat damage. See Rule 510 Combat Damage Step. 702.19b. The controller of an attacking creature with Trample first assigns damage to the creatures blocking it. Once all those blocking creatures are assigned lethal damage, any excess damage is assigned as its controller chooses among those blocking creatures in the player, planeswalkers, or battle the creature is attacking. When checking for assigned lethal damage, take into account damage already marked on the creatures and damage from other creatures that's being assigned during the same combat damage step, but not any ability or effect that might change the amount of damage that's actually dealt. The attacking creature's controller need not assign lethal damage to all those blocking creatures, but in that case, can't assign any damage to the player or planeswalker it's attacking. So it gives an example here, which I think is pretty helpful. A 2/2 creature that can block an additional creature blocks 2 attackers with a 1/1 with no abilities and a 3/3 with Trample. The active player could assign 1 damage from the first attacker and 1 damage from the second to the blocking creature, and the 2 damage to the defending player from the creature with Trample. Another example is a 6/6 green creature with Trample is blocked by a 2/2 with protection from green. The attacking creature's controller must assign at least 2 damage to the blocker. Even though that damage will be prevented by the blocker's protection ability, the attacking creature's controller can divide the rest of the damage as they choose between the blocking creature and the defending player. Now, this is an important note because protection is one of those things most people think of, oh, well, it's protected, no damage is going to get through. With Trample, damage still gets through. So that's a very important thing to note, that if the Trample damage is higher than the creature's toughness with protection, you are still going to be able to get any remaining damage onto the player. 702.19c. Trample over Planeswalkers is a variant of Trample that modifies the rules for assigning combat damage to Planeswalkers. The controller of a creature with Trample over Planeswalkers assigns that creature's combat damage as described in Rule 702.19b, with one exception. If that creature is attacking a Planeswalker, after lethal damage is assigned to all blocking creatures and damage at least equal to the loyalty of the Planeswalker the creature is attacking is assigned to the Planeswalker, further excess damage may be assigned as the attacking creature's controller chooses among those blocking creatures, the Planeswalker in that Planeswalker's controller. When checking for assigned damage equal to a Planeswalker's loyalty, take into account damage from other creatures that's being assigned during the same combat step, but not any abilities or effects that might change the amount of damage that's actually dealt. And they give another example here. So a player controls a Planeswalker with 3 loyalty counters that is being attacked by a 1/1 with no abilities and a 7/7 with Trample over Planeswalkers. The active player could assign 1 damage from the first attacker and 2 damage from the second to the Planeswalker and 5 damage to the defending player from the creature with Trample over Planeswalker. 702.19d. If an attacking creature with Trample or Trample over Planeswalkers is blocked, but there are no creatures blocking it when damage is assigned, its damage is assigned to the defending player and or Planeswalkers as though all blocking creatures have been assigned lethal damage. 702.19e. If a creature with Trample over Planeswalkers is attacking a Planeswalker and that Planeswalker is removed from combat, the creature's damage may be assigned to the defending player once all blocking creatures have been dealt lethal damage, or if there are no blocking creatures when the damage is assigned, all its damage is assigned to the defending player. This is an exception to Rule 506.4c, and it does not cause the creature to be attacking that player. 702.19F. If a creature without trample over planeswalkers is attacking a planeswalker, none of its combat damage can be assigned to the defending player, even if that player has been removed from combat or the damage the attacking creature could assign is greater than the planeswalker's loyalty. And finally, 702.19G. Multiple instances of trample on the same creature are redundant. Multiple instances of trample over planeswalkers on the same creature are also redundant. Trample is an interesting keyword because you can see new variations of it in every set. With new cards in each set, it is interesting that the main two colors are still green and red, and there are some trample seen in some other colors, but really if it doesn't have green or red in it, it probably isn't going to have much trample. Another interesting point of trample creatures is that most of them are often high power or have an ability to grow to deal even more damage. So now that we have the basics of trample, let's look at some commanders that care about trample and some other cards worth adding to your deck. So starting out, we have Ghalta Primal Hunger, Kodama of the West Tree, and Vorinclex Monstrous Raider. So Ghalta Primal Hunger is just simply a big commander with trample, which is very scary. 10 green legendary creature Elder Dinosaur. This spell costs X less to cast, where X is the total power of creatures you control, and this has trample. So one of the most frightening things about this card is commander damage, right? With 2 successful swings with no blocks, you can knock out an opponent very easily. In addition, this card is discounted heavily by the number of big creatures you have. Those creatures are probably also going to have trample, so it becomes a very big threat on your board. Kodama of the West Tree, one of my favorite creatures ever printed, is 2 and a green legendary creature spirit with reach. Modified creatures you control have trample, and whenever a modified creature you control deals combat damage to a player, search your library for a basic land, put on the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. This card fits in almost about anywhere in any deck, because modified creatures can have an equipment, aura, or have counters on them. Those all count as modifiers. That is a big versatility. In addition, most of those creatures that are modified are probably going to be big enough where they're not going to be blocked, and whenever you deal damage, you just get to ramp at an extremely high rate. And Vorinclex Monstrous Raider, 4 green legendary creature Phyrexian Praetor with trample and haste. If you would put 1 or more counters on a permanent or player, put twice that many of each of those kinds of counters on that permanent or player instead. And if an opponent will put 1 or more counters on a permanent or player, they put half that many of each kind of those counters on a permanent or player instead, rounded down. Vorinclex here is pretty strong. You don't see him as much as a commander, but if you're playing a deck that is caring at all about poison counters, which is probably one of the biggest reasons you would put this in a deck, you know, that is just going to accelerate how fast you're able to kill somebody. I play a Flinless Fangbearer deck, and this would just absolutely wreck somebody by doubling the amount of poison counters, making it so you only have to hit with 3 creatures with Death Touch. And talking about Death Touch real quick, I would think it's an important note that because of how trample works, you only have to assign 1 point of damage to count as lethal damage if you have a creature with Death Touch and trample. Now, there are only a couple cards in the game that this is even possible with without having to put some other type of aura or spell on them, but it is a huge thing, and on attacks, you can just destroy a ton of creatures if your opponent decides to block with a bunch of them in that case. So some other creatures that aren't green or red that I thought would be interesting to talk about that have trample or give trample, we have Zetalpa Primal Dawn, Razakath the Foul-Blooded, Audric Lunarch Marshal. Now, starting out here with Zetalpa Primal Dawn, it's 6 white legendary creature Elder Dinosaur with flying, double strike, vigilance, trample, and indestructible. Now, I've probably talked about Zetalpa in another video or two for this Back to the Basics set because it has a ton of keywords, but notably it has trample and double strike, which is a very powerful ability. Some creatures that have double strike, if you were to block with a creature with lower power, they don't get through on the second swing, but because Zetalpa has trample, you can assign lethal combat damage during first strike step, and if that kills the creature, you get to go on ahead and deal damage during that next step. Now, I personally haven't seen many people build Zetalpa as a commander. It is quite expensive, and I think that's the main drawback here. But if you do, I think it could be a very cool commander that you could just buff up because it already has all these amazing keywords on it. Razakath the Foul-Blooded, again, a very expensive card. Now, this is something I would see cheated out of a graveyard, but it's 5 black, leisure creature demon with flying and trample. Pay 2 life, sack another creature, search your library for a card, put the card into your hand, then shuffle. This is an 8/8 with trample. I mean, it has an awesome keyword, and really it didn't need to be an 8/8 as well, but just being able to tutor up any cards you need and put it in your hand is pretty strong. And Razakath here would be a great commander if it didn't cost as much, but I think you could find some ways to get him on the board faster. And then Audric Lunarch Marshal, like always, 3 and a white legendary creature human soldier. At the beginning of each combat, creatures you control gain first strike until end of turn. A creature if you control has first strike. The same is true for flying, death touch, double strike, haste, hexproof, indestructible, lifelink, menace, reach, skulk, trample, and vigilance. If you can just equip your entire board with, I don't know, even half these keywords, you're going to be in a very, very good position. But Audric is one of the best cards I think ever printed because it just is so versatile and is such a key piece, and the turn it comes down and every turn has these great effects. So I think it's a great card and maybe a great commander if you would consider building it. But I want to talk about some other cool cards, and I want to start by looking at some overrun effects. So overrun effects are basically effects that give things trample and buff them up at the same time. So first off, we have Endrazor Forerunner, Overwhelming Stampede, and Triumph of the Hordes. Endrazor Forerunner is 5 green creature boar with Vigilance, Trample, Haste, and whenever it enters the battlefield, other creatures you control get +2/+2 and gain Vigilance and Trample until end of turn. This certainly, like all of these, is a win con, basically giving all of your stuff, whether you're playing creature tokens or you just have a bunch of big creatures. If you can get this onto the board for 8 mana, you can possibly just win the game. Overwhelming Stampede is 3 green sorcery until end of turn. Creatures you control gain Trample and get +X/+X, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. That's awesome. This is an awesome effect because let's say you have one of those big commanders out that has 5, 6, 7, 8 power on the board. Buffing everything by that much is just too much, and it is an overwhelming stampede. And Triumph of the Hordes is 2 green sorcery until end of turn. Creatures you control get +1/+1, gain Trample, and Infect. This is one of the more salty versions of this overrun effect. I wouldn't recommend it myself. It's just very, very powerful, but it can kind of make some people upset because people don't like to die to infect. But hey, it's a win con. It's one of the cheaper ones, and that's why it only buffs by 1, but it also gives infect, so you got that to look forward to as well. But I would be very disappointed in myself if I didn't talk about it as an overrun effect. But we have Crater Hoof Behemoth, 5 green creature beast with haste. When Crater Hoof Behemoth enters the battlefield, creatures you control gain Trample and get +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of creatures you control. This is a staple card in any Trample winning strategy. I mean, Crater Hoof Behemoth is one of the biggest win cons in green. It's pretty salty for that reason, but hey, listen, it's 8 mana. The only reason this kind of is not as fair in a lot of cases, because you are generally cheating this into play. It has haste already, so if you use Reanimate or something, you're taking 8 life, but you're probably going to be killing 1, if not all opponents. So it's worth talking about. So now I want to talk about some other equipment or cards that give creatures trample. So first off, we have Garruk's Uprising, Shadow Spear, Kessig Wolf Run. Garruk's Uprising is 2 and a green enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, if you control a creature power 4 or greater, draw a card. Creatures you control have trample, and whenever a creature's power 4 or greater enters battlefield under control, draw a card. This is one of my favorite cards to play that gives trample because it just gives everything trample and draws you a ton of cards. It's kind of one of those first cards I look at when I'm building a big creature green deck because it's going to give you a lot of value. It's cheap to get onto the battlefield, and I really like it. Shadow Spear, what else can I say? It's a staple card, single generic mana, legendary artifact equipment, gives a creature +1/+1, trample, and lifelink, which is super important. It can remove hexproof and indestructible from your opponent's creatures, and it just equips for 2. Very easy and very powerful. And Kessig Wolf Run, land, taps add a generic mana, or X, red and a green, tap, target creature gets +X/+0 and gains trample until end of turn. This is a very, very easy way to kill an opponent, especially if you have a commander. You can commander damage them out very easily. If you're playing red and green, obviously you're probably generating a ton of mana. But let's look at some other things that give trample, and we have Haunted Cloak, Rancor, and Luxodon Warhammer. Haunted Cloak is 3 generic artifact equipment, where the crypt creature has Vigilance, Trample, and Haste, and you equip for 1. This is actually a really powerful card. I don't think most people realize how good this card is. Giving Haste is an awesome effect, especially because you equip for 1 mana, meaning you can play a pretty big thing, and if you have 1 mana left over, you can just immediately attack with it that turn. Is very powerful. Obviously, Swiftfoot Boots is one of the most played artifacts equipment in Magic the Gathering, but Lightning Greaves as well because it gives haste. And well, you have to put 1 more mana in when you cast this. You get a huge amount of benefits by giving Vigilance and Trample as well. Rancor is a single green enchantment aura with enchant creature. Enchanted creature gets +2/+0 and has Trample. And whenever Rancor is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, return it to its owner's hand. Being able to give stuff Trample over and over again as soon as it dies and you just get it right back seems very good. And Luxodon Warhammer, very similar great abilities as Shadow Spear, giving trample and lifelink, because you're probably attacking with a big creature, so you're probably going to be gaining a ton of life. But 3 generic artifact equipment. Equip creature gets +3/+0 and gains trample and lifelink. Equip for 3. This one is a bit more mana to equip, but lifelink is a very strong ability for that reason. So next up, I want to show some very powerful creatures that have trample and can kind of do some great effects that might win you the game. So starting out, we have Hellkite Tyrant, Vigor, and Phyrexian Obliterator. Hellkite Tyrant is 4 red creature dragon with flying and trample. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, gain control of all artifacts the player controls, and at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 20 or more artifacts, you just win the game. The fact that this has flying and trample is pretty strong, because a lot of people might have some flying creatures, but they're probably not that big. And controlling 20 or more artifacts is not that big a deal. You could very much easily win the game, whether or not you steal stuff from your opponents, but you just might make yourself such a big threat that your opponents have to deal with you. Vigor, one of my favorite green cards, 3 green, creature elemental incarnation with trample. If damage would be dealt to another creature you control, prevent that damage and put a +1/+1 counter on that creature for each 1 damage prevented this way. When Vigor is put into a graveyard from anywhere, shuffle it into its owner's library. Notably here, this works great with Kodama because you're putting counters on. Vigor basically makes all your creatures indestructible, but also places counters on them whenever they receive a certain amount of damage. So if you have Vigor on the board, there's a very high likelihood, if nobody can remove it, you're just going to get a bigger and bigger board every turn and win the game. And then Phyrexian Obliterator is 4 black pips. Creature, Phyrexian Horror with trample. Whenever a source deals damage to Phyrexian Obliterator, that source's controller sacks that many permanents. This is a huge threat. You know, we just got this reprinted not too long ago in All Will Be One, and it was a staple back when it came out in New Phyrexia. It's a staple now. I mean, this is a huge card. If you can equip this with something like a fight spell and just attack one of your opponent's stuff and make them sack their entire board, it is devastating. And Phyrexian Obliterator is just one of those great cards that I hate playing against because you're always losing. So it's just so good, and the fact that it has trample is incredible. And there are just a couple more cards I want to talk about before we end today. And we have Mana Gorger Hydra, Ram Through, and Quartzwood Crasher. Mana Gorger Hydra is 2 and a green creature Hydra with trample, and whenever a player casts a spell, put a +1/+1 counter on Mana Gorger Hydra. If you've ever played a game with this, especially if someone's able to ramp and get this out on turn 2, you will just know how big this gets so quickly, and this is a game ender. You don't realize how many spells you cast until somebody's counting with Mana Gorger Hydra, and especially that blue or white player that just is casting all of those little instants and doing all these things is just growing this over and over and over again. And within a turn or two, this could very easily be a 20/20 without anybody realizing it, and it's just a staple card that I think more people should play. Ram Through is 1 in a green instant. Target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control. If that creature you control has trample, excess damage is dealt to that creature's controller instead. Normally here, trample doesn't get through, which is an important fact. You know, trample doesn't work in these fight type mechanics. It only works during combat, but Ram Through says, no, we're actually going to deal that damage anyways. And if you have a 20/20 Mana Gorger Hydra and you're fighting a 1/1, well, 19 of that damage is getting through. So very interesting card to put in any deck that has very big trample creatures. And Quartzwood Crasher, 2 red creature dinosaur beast with trample. Whenever 1 or more creatures you control with trample deal combat damage to a player, create an XX green dinosaur beast creature token with trample, where X is the amount of damage those creatures dealt to that player. You just get to make giant beasts that have trample that just make even bigger beasts every turn. Anytime I've played against Quartzwood Crasher, I always immediately take note and say I gotta kill that as fast as possible, because if we don't, we're just gonna be overrun with so many big trample creatures. But with that, I would like to say thank you so much for watching. I really hope you like this video. I'm sorry this one took a bit longer than normal. There's a ton of things to talk about with trample, especially those keywords at the beginning can just take forever. So thank you for your patience if you made it all the way through. If you're new to Magic or you're just trying to learn some keywords, I appreciate you checking this out. If you consider sharing it with a friend, leaving a like and subscribing, that would mean the world to me. In addition, if there's other cards with trample you think deserve to be talked about, or you love playing in your decks, please let me know in the comments down below. I would love to see it. So now let's talk about today's Scryfall card of the day, which is Harvest Season, a true reflection of nature, death fostering life. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, I'll see you later, Planeswalkers.